We are going to be discussing the book Dare to Speak by author Suzanne Nossel, who's joined us tonight. Suzanne Nossel currently serves as the Chief Executive Officer of PEN America, which is one of the leading human rights and free expression organizations in the US. Prior to joining PEN America in 2013, Ms. Nossel's career spanned government service and leadership roles in the corporate and nonprofit sectors. She has served as the Chief Operating Officer of Human Rights Watch and as the Executive Director of Amnesty International. During the first Obama administration, she served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for International Relations, and during the Clinton administration, as the Deputy to the US Ambassador for UN Management and Reform. She was also Vice President of US Business Development for Bertelsmann and Vice President for Strategy and Operations at the Wall Street Journal. She is a leading voice on free expression issues in the United States and globally, writing and being interviewed frequently for national and international media outlets. Tonight, she's with us to discuss her recent book, Dare to Speak, Defending Free Speech for All. Our moderator for this evening is our own Fabian Bedne. Fabian currently works with Mayor John Cooper as planner for neighborhood development and infrastructure and is a former two-term member of the City Council. Fabian also works tirelessly on a number of volunteer efforts around Nashville, especially related to affordable housing and equity. He is the 2020 recipient of the Amigo of the Year Award from the Nashville Area Hispanic Chamber of Commerce. Thank you to both of you for participating with us tonight and helping to facilitate the discussion that we're going to have. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Fabian.
I'm one of those millions of people that forgets to unmute himself. So having completed that, I want to say thank you everybody that is joining us today. And mostly I'm honored to be part of this conversation with Suzanne, who's an amazing advocate for some of the things that make this country great. And so, Suzanne, appreciate you joining us today. And I wanted to, jump right in and ask you, the question is everybody's thinking is, why did you decide to write this book?
Yeah, sure. Well, it grew out of my work at PEN America, which is a free speech organization. We defend free speech both around the world, working on behalf of imperiled writers in places like Iran and Turkey, Russia and China, but also here in our own country. And our work here in the United States has intensified over the last few years. And one of our programs deals with free speech on college campuses and the kinds of controversies that have erupted in recent years over deplatforming speakers, insisting that people like Christine Lagarde, the president of the World Bank, or Condoleezza Rice, former Secretary of State, not be given prominent podiums on college campuses, the demand that college campuses be treated as safe spaces for students where they won't encounter uncomfortable ideas. And as PEN America, we've documented those issues and reported on them and really tried to bring a balanced perspective. The way that we look at that is that a rising generation here in this country is doing the work of trying to bring about a more equal, inclusive, just, anti-racist America. And that's unfinished business that our country sits with, a stubborn legacy of racism and bigotry toward on the basis of religion, gender, and other grounds. And they are right to insist that we try to break down those barriers, but at times that can cross over into censoriousness and an intolerance of viewpoints and opinions that people disagree with. And as I went around to college campuses, I began to be concerned that we were at risk of losing a rising generation to the principle of free speech. I kept meeting students who had encountered free speech only in the context of it being invoked to protect speech that they found menacing, racial slurs, stereotypes, noxious expression, make America great again. Well, that's free speech, and it is free speech, absolutely. But if you hear the term free speech invoked time and again, only to protect speech that you find in some way threatening or objectionable, you may begin to wonder, does this principle sort of have much to do with me? And we knew that a rising generation tended to be more liberal, more left-leaning, and became a real concern that if they were turned off of the principle of free speech, didn't see it as something for them, that this prime place of free speech enshrined in the First Amendment to the Constitution, and such a bedrock underpinning of our society, creative expression, scientific progress, so many of the things that we treasure about living in this country, that all of that really could be in jeopardy if, sort of 10, 20, 30 years from now, your average adult thought that free speech was something that should be subordinated to other social goods or values. And so I really wrote the book trying to reframe free speech in a way that I think takes account of those concerns and reconciles it with the drive toward a more equal, inclusive, and just society. Because I think both sets of principles are essential and that they can and must coexist. So the book is organized around 20 principles for how I hope we can learn to live together in our diverse, digitized, and divided country without curbing robust protections for free speech.
Yeah, your book is also like a how to deal with these things. So what has been the response to the book?
It's been interesting. I mean, it's a strange experience to release a book during a pandemic. The book was supposed to come out in May, and I would have been flying around the country to bookstores and event venues, all concentrated within a space of a couple of weeks. And of course, that was blown up. The release of the book was postponed by a couple of months. And I've been doing talks all over the country on college campuses, law schools, bookstores. I spoke to a group of heads of private boarding schools last week. Today at lunchtime, I was speaking to a group of First Amendment lawyers. And I am trying to sort of broaden this conversation about free speech. One of the things I talk about in the book is how traditionally Americans have been able to, really, you say free speech and an American says, oh yeah, First Amendment. And it's kind of like, that's all it is. And we've always had the sense that we can rely on law and courts and attorneys to defend these rights for us. And one of the things I argue in the book is that increasingly the ways in which free speech is threatened, whether it's by social media companies, policies, or just online harassment and the Twitter mob, or censoriousness in a college classroom, those things don't involve the state. And the First Amendment, of course, only prohibits infringements on free speech by government actors. And it's been broadened to be not just the Congress, but also, entities like a public university or a public school are bound by the First Amendment, but private companies and private individuals are not. And so it's my view that to uphold the value of free speech and the benefits of free speech in our society now, we need to take a much more encompassing view and not simply kind of expect that this will be taken care of by the courts and the lawyers. And so that's why it's been very important to me to talk to other kinds of audiences and help people, I hope, recognize what role we play as citizens and what role institutions, whether it's a Jewish federation or a school or an organization like PEN America, what role we all have to play in this.
Well, I have to say we're thankful that you included us in your effort to reach out to people. We are happy to have you here with us today. You mentioned something about university campuses, and I wanted to ask you, what is your opinion about cancel culture? Or it is something that is called that way. And how do you feel about, what is your concern about it?
Yeah, look, I think the term cancel culture we use too elastically. We can use it to, mean everything from, on the one hand, sort of a Harvey Weinstein or a Bill Cosby, people who have been convicted of crimes, who, I think for good reason, we have turned away from and shunned as a society. They would not be welcome in many people's houses. And there's some people who might not want to watch their movies or their television shows. And that's one thing. On the other side of the spectrum, you have people, I'll give the example of Ian Baruma, the editor of the New York Review of Books, who published a piece that was criticized very heavily for offering an individual Canadian journalist who was the subject of accusations of sexual harassment, a kind of lengthy forum in the review to kind of tell his side of the story and give the perspective of a kind of Me Too accused. And there was a lot of criticism of that piece, so much so that Ian Baruma was out of a job within a couple of days. And, that to me is the dark side of cancel culture. But I do think you have to make a distinction between, what the underlying offense is. And there's some underlying offenses, if it's criminal, if it's like a pattern of pervasive mistreatment of other people, that may warrant somebody falling out of good graces. But if it is, a misplaced editorial decision, publishing an op-ed, which, we all know the story of the New York Times, op-ed editor, James Bennett, out of a job after the op-ed by Tom Cotton was published. I think those incidences where it's a single misjudgment, a fleeting act, not reflective of a longstanding pattern of bias or misconduct, I think the demand that tends to come, and what people are talking about when they talk about cancel culture is sort of this drumbeat that mounts from an audience, oftentimes on social media, that will not be satisfied until a punishment is exacted. And what bothers me about that is, this idea that it's a good thing for the institution to punish speech, that, journalists at the Times will be better off if their employer punishes a colleague for, publishing an ill-advised op-ed. Because, one time, that this time it's the op-ed by Tom Cotton that's the grounds for the punishment. But who knows what it will be next time? And once those editors sort of have asserted that power to punish on the basis of an editorial misjudgment, it's going to be exercised again. And the next time, it may be an editorial misjudgment of a very different kind and something that people disagree with. And I think we're better off just erring on the side of protecting the speaker and asking our authorities to be very restrained in exacting those punishments. I think that is the approach that makes more space for speech, and that when people see these incidents, it affects not only the individual, who is out of a job and may have a hard time, continuing with their career. For Ian Baruma, he told me that, not only was he kicked out of the New York Review of Books, but all other publications that for years had worked with him and printed his pieces said, well, we can't touch you for a while. For him, it passed. And, that's something I talk about as well. The fact that this I don't think should be permanent. I think we need pathways for people to kind of come back online. These are informal punishments. There's no sentence, there's no time served, there's no finite duration for, the kind of expiation that these people go through. And I think, as a society that values free speech, we ought to be on the lookout for ways to enable people's voices to be heard again.
I like so much what you're saying. I grew up under the dictatorship in Argentina, and my brother was killed for having an opinion. And so many people couldn't really speak up on what they believe or wanted to say because there was this oppressive government that had one point of view. So when I got here, my first year here, I started breathing this freedom of not being afraid. And it was really weird because I didn't even notice what I was experiencing. It took me a while. And then I remember I started dating my wife, who's now my wife. And one day I was complaining to her about Nazi propaganda, that we should make it illegal. And then she taught me, really explained to me that, once you stop the Nazis from speaking, then other people will be stopped from speaking. So do you have any experience, or have you experienced other immigrants like me that have shared with you this dichotomy or the contrast between civil rights in the US, which everybody experienced, but nobody seemed to necessarily understand because they take it for granted like oxygen? And I just was wondering what's your opinion about it?
Yeah, no, I've thought about that a lot. I talk about it somewhat in the book because we do a lot of work at PEN America on free speech around the world. And, one of the points I make in the book is that, when people call into question the breadth of the First Amendment and begin to ask, as they are asking more and more frequently these days, shouldn't we consider paring back the protections of the First Amendment and allowing the government to restrict more speech because hate speech is running rampant, because speech is weaponized on the internet in ways that the framers of the Constitution certainly could never have contemplated, because we now know that particularly minority populations in this country may suffer disproportionately from the impact of noxious and bigoted speech. So all of these reasons that people summon to argue that the very sweeping protections for speech afforded by the First Amendment may not be such a good idea, that they may not take account of these subsequent developments that ought to cause us to reconsider. What I say is, look at the rest of the world, and what things are like in places where the government is not constrained from cracking down on speech. And what we see invariably is that when the government has that power, they tend to use it in very self-serving ways to often reinforce their own prerogatives, to target dissidents and critics, I'm guessing like your brother. The impact is not to protect the powerless or give voice to the powerless, but rather to reinforce those who are in positions of authority. And I think that historically, is absolutely been the tendency. The counter argument is, countries like some of the European countries, Canada, that do allow, they still have robust protections for free speech, but they allow some more restrictions than we do. For example, the example that's often given, is Holocaust denial, which is illegal in many parts of Europe. And, those countries can and do restrict it. Now, Facebook has followed that example and enacted its own ban on Holocaust denial on their platform. And one of the arguments that I have made, it's interesting actually, when Facebook announced this, I did a kind of thread on Twitter talking about it. And, the concern that I have is one that arose in the context of my work at the State Department when I was leading US efforts at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva. And one of the issues on the table there was an effort by Islamic countries around the world to secure a global ban on what they called the defamation of religion. And so this has to do with the cartoons of the Muslim prophet Muhammad, those satirical cartoons that were published in a Danish newspaper and provoked or sparked riots around the world outside Danish diplomatic installations and led to killings and created a huge amount of pressure in these Islamic countries in their capitals for the governments to do something about this rising tide of religious intolerance around the world. And it was in the years after 9/11 where Islamophobia, was surging and was a very legitimate issue. And so, their answer was, let's go to the UN and let's seek a global ban on the defamation of religion. And as the delegation of the United States, we were dead set against that, as were the Europeans, the Canadians, the Australians, and others, as an infringement on free expression. Here in this country, you're allowed to publish cartoons of the Muslim prophet Muhammad and, all kinds of other satire. And one of the arguments that frequently arose in the context of that debate was, well, you ban Holocaust denial, and that rule is in place to protect Jews from hatred and bigotry. So, we're just asking for something comparable in relation to Muslims. And so, over time, we actually got past that in the case of the ban on defamation by approaching the Islamic delegations. I actually traveled to Pakistan to propose to them what we take a different approach, that instead of having this very contentious battle over the proposed defamation resolution, that we kind of come together around a set of measures to address the underlying issues of religious intolerance. I was part of the Obama administration, and President Obama, you'll remember, with his Cairo speech, really was trying to reach out an olive branch to the Muslim world. And so it was very contradictory for us to be just duking it out with them at the UN. And we proposed a more kind of practical approach focused on measures to actually address the problem of intolerance toward Muslims, things like dialogue and education and interfaith engagement. And gradually they got behind it, and it ended up being a big success in the sense that they dropped the agenda of trying to get a ban on the defamation of religion. And we came together on a consensus resolution that centered on these practical measures. Anyway, to bring it up to the present, I mean, I wish that issue was really a past issue. It's of course not. I mean, we had, there was this horrific murder of a French teacher just last week because of a lesson about basically the Muslim cartoons. This teacher was beheaded outside of school about a week ago in France. So it's very much a live issue. But just last week as well, or about 2 weeks ago, Mark Zuckerberg announced that Facebook is now going to ban Holocaust denial on the platform. And there was a lot of engagement, had been a lot of engagement over time by Jewish groups encouraging this move and really pointing to ways that Holocaust denial is contributing to the rise in anti-Semitism that we are experiencing today. And the question that I asked is, the day that was announced is, what's going to be next? Because we're going to see, for example, Muslims coming forward to say Islamophobia should be completely expunged from the Facebook platform. And in fact, just today, the Prime Minister of Pakistan approached made a public request of Mark Zuckerberg to expunge Islamophobia from the platform and invoked Holocaust, sort of said, the exact same argument, you're doing it for Holocaust denial. Kind of what about us? And, then the question, of course, becomes, if that's expunged, what is next? And, and who decides, when you get to sort of contentious borderline issues, and I often think of the Israel-Palestine debate as one example where both sides accuse one another of engaging in hate speech. And it becomes very difficult to know where these lines can be drawn.
And well, congratulations on being able to find common ground in the UN. That's quite an achievement. So what are the limits then on hate speech? I mean, is the government supposed to do what they say? You cannot scream fire on a crowded theater. I mean, how do we manage that? That's so very important protection that we have.
Yeah, look, here in this country, the limits on hate speech are quite narrow. It's only incitement to imminent violence that can be legally banned or punished. So only, if I say to you or to a gang of people, let's now go and attack, this group over there, and here are the knives and here are the guns, and let's go after them. That's incitement to imminent violence. But if I said to you, they're awful, we should attack them, let's talk tomorrow about doing it, that's not incitement to imminent violence. It's got to meet the three criteria of in the incitement and then the imminence and then the violence. And so it's a very kind of strict standard for when hateful speech can be prohibited. And there's an awful lot of really noxious and problematic hateful speech, including anti-Semitic speech, racist speech, Islamophobic speech that is protected in this country, and, that doesn't mean it's not a problem. That doesn't mean, that the First Amendment sort of valorizes that speech, or that as free speech advocates, we should just throw up our hands and say, that's too bad because the First Amendment protects that speech. I don't think so. I actually devote a chapter in the book to arguing that the defense of free speech demands a very active, forward-leaning approach to trying to combat hateful speech and hate crimes. And that, there are a whole range of ways to do that I kind of spell out in the book. When it comes to hateful speech, it can be counter speech, it can be condemnation, it can be, sometimes it's possible to engage in dialogue and to persuade people to abandon their hateful ways. But I don't think a passive approach of simply sitting back is going to work. I think what that has done, and we've seen this over the last few years, is actually intensified the demand for more regulation of speech. I think this president has sort of uncorked hateful speech, which is now coursing through society, and people have this sense, well, something has to be done, and that something, very often is asking authorities of one kind or another, whether it be they private companies or government, to intercede and to constrict our speech rights, because this problem is seen as running out of control. And so I think it falls to us as citizens and institutional leaders to lean forward in addressing the problem of hateful speech and hate crimes, so as not to strengthen the argument to pare back the First Amendment. I quote from a prosecutor who was addressing a white supremacist crime, and sort of made clear that to the extent that hateful speech was involved, it was protected by the First Amendment, but that where it had crossed over into actual crimes, that these prosecutors were going to stop at nothing to go after these white supremacists. And he uses this very winging language about how, we don't sleep, and we'll find you at any time of night, wherever you are. And, what I think that does is sends a signal to those who feel vulnerable and victimized and attacked by hateful speech, that they're not alone, that there are forceful entities and individuals within society who are on their side, who are ready and willing to take action, and who are taking the problem seriously. And I think that can help quell the demand to use the approach of greater regulation of speech.
Yeah. As you were talking, I was remembering times when I got calls from constituents just saying awful things about Latinos. I'm Latino. And then just listening to them thinking, I'm not in this place to judge people or to tell them how to think, and try to hear what their issue was so I could help them. So I think I understand for personal experience what you're saying. So I have one last question for you, and I'm going to read it. Barry Weiss had a recent article raising concerns about Dr. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. We have been conducting a series of book groups discussions on this book. And the question is, what do you think about the criticism raised by Dr. Barry Weiss?
Yeah, well, look, I have some sympathy with it, but I also think what's sort of missing from her perspective is honestly the ability to put herself in someone else's shoes. I mean, she is someone who, writes very passionately from this perspective of this, young Jewish woman raised in Pittsburgh with an enormous amount of pride in her heritage. And it's powerful, but, I think what we're all trying to do right now is have a little more recognition of the perspective of other people in this society, and in the case of Ibram Kendi's book, of, what it's like to be a Black American and how things look through that lens. And I ultimately, I think it's a mistake to sort of characterize this project of racial justice reckoning and the kind of, I see it as sort of a moment that we're in right now where we're trying to push forward to a higher level of equality and inclusion and the dismantling of racism in our society. And that, yes, there are some illiberal impulses within that movement. And, I've written about them too, and they concern me. But my approach is to try to kind of bring together and honestly explain to those who are on the forefront of that fight why it is that principles of free speech should be seen as tools and aids and abettors of the cause that they're trying to advance, rather than as impediments. And, I mean, maybe I'm just more of an optimist, but I actually believe in my own experience, talking with people on college campuses and across the country suggests to me, when you explain it, they get it. When people are out in the street protesting and they see police engaging in excessive use of force, or they're kettled into a small area, or their rights are constrained, they see in a very powerful way, why it is that the free speech rights that are enshrined in the Constitution are important to the causes they care about and the fights that they are waging. And I think that's the case that we ought to make, not the case that these causes are fundamentally at odds, and that the further Ibram Kendi gets, the more imperiled we as Jews will be. I think that's just kind of, to me, not a constructive way of thinking.
So we're going into the breakout rooms, but before we do that, do you have any other comments, something I didn't ask you that you wanted to share with the whole group before we go into the smaller rooms?
No, I mean, I'm happy to, maybe I'll just say a little bit about the book and how it is organized. So it's organized into 20 principles, and the first 5 principles are for speakers. So it's like when you're speaking out, I advise things like using words conscientiously, being your own editor, and kind of thinking twice about what you say, presuming heterodoxy with your audience. And then I have other principles, including a higher duty of care if you have a powerful platform, the importance of finding ways to express difficult ideas, defending those who voice unpopular opinions. And then my next section is about when you're in the position as a listener, because it's really often the listeners who are the most censorious. If you think about what shuts speech down, it's very often some kind of protest or objection voiced by listeners. So I encourage people to take into account intent and context when they're evaluating speech, and not to jump to conclusions, to be careful and conscientious when they are calling out, doing call outs, that, there's a place for that, but that it should be done conscientiously. This point about fighting hate speech and hate crimes. And then my last 2 sections are about how to debate free speech issues and how to reflect on free speech policy questions, including what the role of platforms like Facebook and Twitter ought to be when it comes to regulating our landscape for free speech. So that's just kind of a quick overview of what's in the book.
Well, I highly recommend people to get your book and read it, because it had a lot of good ideas and suggestions that I think people are going to enjoy. So now we're going to go into different rooms. Please don't leave the meeting. We are not over. And Suzanne and I are going to be stopping by all the rooms. So we are going to be subdivided shortly, and then we'll wrap it up later all together again.
Okay, I think everyone is back from their groups now. So we're going to have just a few minutes where the groups kind of report back on what they talked about in their groups. So I'm just going to go, I have my list alphabetical of the moderators. So Teena, are you here? Can you go first and tell us what your group talked about?
We unmute. We talked about a lot. It was a very, very lively group. We could still be talking. One individual talked about being an independent business person in the community and feeling like it is so difficult maneuvering in the business world because using language has become like a landmine. And this is a concern, and he or she, I'm not going to go there, is concerned about that. And then we went on, somebody else mentioned learning how to be an ally to help a cause, learning how to be a good listener. And of course, when Suzanne came on, she talked about 20 principles. And we also discussed the need for racial justice reckoning. We also talked about some other books. Somebody talked about racism and what it really is, and doesn't think of himself as being racist. And of course, we talked about Kendi, and he says everybody has some racism, internally. And we talked about the book Stamped, which Jessica was gracious enough to put online where you can buy it and who wrote it, Jason Reynolds, etc., and Kendi. So, and that book is a YA book that really goes back to the very beginning of slavery and goes through the history. It is a very good source. So that's enough. So we talked about, I hope I've honored what you've said.
Great, thank you. Sara, can you talk to us about your group?
Sure. Gonna hope to to cover all of it, but you know, we talked about the need for diversity of opinions, and that's one of the fears of this idea of shutting down speech is not getting to, you know, hear somebody else's viewpoint, which either strengthens your own or helps you learn something that you didn't know before. And so it's the fear of, you know, the importance of actually welcoming other speech from people who think differently from you and avoiding that bubble that we create around ourselves, so to speak. But we also talked about how it's important to recognize the difference between facts and opinions, and the importance of fact checking, because that's what is where we feel like a lot of the trouble comes in. We also went into a little bit about, you know, just the amount of mistrust there is right now, you know, because everybody wants to be right, but nobody wants to concede their position. And the role, and when Suzanne joined us, we talked about a couple really great topics that I wish we had had more time for. One was, you know, the role of call in versus call out, you know, that they each have their own purpose. And, you know, with the call in, you can actually make a personal connection, really, you know, get to know somebody else's viewpoint. And, you know, maybe if they did something wrong, you call them in. And if you have that personal relationship, you can speak to them and maybe help them understand why, you know, a term that they used wasn't appropriate. But if you see it in a more public person or someone who just won't get it, they keep repeatedly, willfully making the same mistake, that a call out might be more appropriate. And then we also ended with a little bit about the historical culture, cancel culture, you know, like past presidents that we've had and other people's names who are on buildings, and you know, what should we do in the present with that? So
Great. Deborah, can you talk to us about your group?
So yes, we also had a lively conversation, and several of the members of our group shared personal experience where, for whatever reason, either because of the way they look or something about them, that there are judgments made and stereotypes made about them, and the difficulty of being perceived a certain way just because of who you are, and not even having the ability to express yourself personally before those judgments are made, and how difficult that can be for people. We also talked just a little bit about the free speech or lack of free speech used by the court appointees in the Supreme Court appointees in the confirmation process, and how they have often refrained from speaking publicly on things, and how that has been a part of the confirmation process lately, and which is just, you know, part of that process, but how that can be frustrating as the people who are listening to it, as these people are being appointed to lifetime positions, and not being able to get more information from them before that appointment and confirmation is made. So I think that pretty much covers.
Great. Craig, can you talk about your group?
Sure. We spent the bulk of our time talking about our personal experiences around free speech, times when we felt uncomfortable about things, and various experiences we had had. But there was one key theme that a lot of us shared that came out of it that I think is worth thinking about. And a clear distinction was made about people speaking up about controversial and difficult ideas and opinions, and people telling factually inaccurate lies, deliberate misinformation. And there was a sense that really those two things, there might be a need to treat them somewhat differently, in that the factually incorrect things where people are trying to create a false reality in people just has a very different, and I would argue more dangerous character. I'll throw in one thing I was going to say to the group that we ran out of time before I did, is I see this around the pandemic and the whole issue of masks. Is I think it's extremely dangerous that we're being lied to by certain political leaders about the efficacy and importance of wearing a mask in public, and people are dying as a result of it. And so I see that as an extreme example of where factually inaccurate speech can be really dangerous, and that we really need to handle them perhaps in a way that's very different from difficult ideas and difficult opinions that are presented as such.
All right, it sounds like everyone had very engaging and lively discussions. It looks like we lost a few people in the coming back process. So I think we're at a manageable enough size right now that if people have questions at this point, we'd like to hear from the audience. If there are things that you haven't had a chance to ask Suzanne yet, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask now. If you don't, I will ask questions myself, but you might want to get yours in. So.
I have a question that came into me via email. And the question is, in the countries where Holocaust deniers are outlawed, has free speech actually suffered? Has there been a suffer of free speech as a result of making Holocaust denial, making that outlawed?
You know, I mean, it's I think a fair question. You know, I suppose the answer is yes. You know, there's some speech that quite clearly, you know, you cannot say, but, you know, is it speech that, you know, has any value? You know, is there anything wrong with Holocaust denial being erased from the discourse? You know, probably a lot of us on this call would say no, you know, but the issue does become, you know, how is that principle that certain types of speech are so noxious as to be off limits? You know, what other speech goes into that category? You know, should Islamophobic cartoons be put in that category? You know, what about misogynist speech? You know, what about anti-Palestinian speech? And so, you know, you kind of quickly go down this path of having to consider all kinds of different types of speech and whether to treat them equivalently. In much of Europe, they don't. I mean, Holocaust denial is sort of in its own category, and you can understand why, you know, for historical reasons, but that does then underscore this sense of resentment that certain other groups, when I talked about Muslims, you know, I don't think they're the only ones, you know, what they feel is that, well, they're being afforded less protection on the basis of their religion than Jews are. And, you know, in this country, we know we have the Equal Protection Clause, and it's also a principle under international law of equality. So I think that comes into play. I mean, the other thing that I've looked at is, you know, the other question I think we should ask is, does it cut down on anti-Semitism? And I have looked at the statistics in terms of, you know, we know that anti-Semitism is on the rise around the world. But if you look at the statistics between 2018 and 2019, which is the last period for which full data is available, the increase in anti-Semitic incidents in the United States and in Germany is like exactly equivalent. I mean, almost kind of eerily parallel. And so it's just not at all clear that the Holocaust denial law is protecting against anti-Semitism, because it seems to be spiking there just as it is here, regardless of the law.
So could you follow up on that with the working definition of anti-Semitism from the IHRA and how that fits into all of this?
Yeah, sure. You know, I don't know if everyone knows what this is, but basically it's a definition, and I'll kind of paraphrase it, but it's a definition of anti-Semitism that was created, and I know the person who actually drafted it, and it was created for the purpose of tracking patterns of anti-Semitism around the world. So there were sort of researchers and perhaps diplomats who were asked to log anti-Semitic speech and incidents to be collected as part of a kind of observatory to look at the trends. And in order to instruct them on what they were looking for, there's this pretty expansive definition of anti-Semitism that gives a series of examples, you know, like calling out, you know, applying a double standard to Israel as the Jewish state, or, you know, expecting more from Israel than you do from other nations. And, you know, they're kind of a series of examples, you know, some of them relate to kind of historic anti-Semitic tropes. So it's a very kind of elaborate definition, and it was developed for that purpose. And then what happened was it was adopted by the State Department for this data tracking effort. And subsequently, there's been an effort to adopt it more broadly, and particularly in relation to anti-Semitism on campuses, so that campuses would be instructed that anything that, that this definition is to be applied to help ascertain whether there's a civil rights violation, and kind of religious discrimination on campus. And that's been controversial, and I've argued against it and even testified against it, because I think that kind of I again, it's the same argument I was spelling out a little bit earlier, where I think about, well, okay, if we're having this, detailed, elaborate definition of what can constitute anti-Semitism, what's next? Detailed, elaborate definition of what can constitute, anti-Islamic sentiment. It can be, a satirical cartoon. It can be a person with a turban. It can be, what you say about brown skin, what about sexism? Think of the endless manifestations of sexism, in speech and depictions that you might enumerate if you were trying to tell someone what sexism can look like and sound like. And it just, to me, to go down that path of trying to elaborate every possible variation and codify it in law, really runs a substantial risk of impinging upon free speech. And it doesn't mean that, a lawyer or a court or an adjudicator would be barred from taking into account this definition or these examples or the historic tropes or all the other, they can make a fact-specific analysis of whether there's been anti-Semitism or racism or sexism, and they should. And those factors should be taken into account. But I don't like the idea of kind of spelling it out in that minute detail.
All right, thank you. I think we have time for one or two more questions. Anybody else have a question?
Yeah, hi, Suzanne. It's Donovan Robertson. I have a question, and you touched on racism, and I want to ask you a question about the use of how we replace. I'm going to use a word, and please don't be offended, folks. How we've replaced nigger with the N word, and in essence, if we are saying the N word, aren't we saying the same thing, because we know exactly what it is replacing? And in essence, we end up saying the N-word more frequently, try to explain what somebody said, and it's only increasing its use. And so someone says the N-word, and then it's all on TV and the news saying, well, this person said the N-word, and it's kind of insane.
Yeah.
For me.
Well, it's a really interesting perspective. And I do talk about that word in the book, because the way it's come up for us at our work in Penn America is basically there've been a kind of a whole slew of professors over the last 5 years who have spoken the full word out in class in a context that they're not using it as a slur. They're not sort of, calling someone by that word, but they're referencing it in a pedagogical context. So maybe they're, reading Mark Twain, or they're reading James Baldwin, or, in one case, the University of Chicago, the professor was teaching a lesson on the doctrine of fighting words. And he was sort of trying to illustrate words that can elicit a really intense incendiary response. And time and again, the students, regardless of the context in which the term was used, the students would react to it as if it was just used straight out as the slur. And there were calls for these professors to be punished and disciplined, and some of them were. And, the professors were taken aback, and they would sort of talk about what's called the use-mention distinction. Like, there's a difference between using the word and mentioning the word. They were just mentioning the word, and, they were doing it sort of for a reason, to teach something. And, what I ended up concluding is that sort of to be a professor in 2020, teaching a heterogeneous group of students, you actually have to be on notice about the reaction that this elicits, and that, you've got to kind of have your head in the sand not to realize that it's a major decision to say this word out loud, and that you're going to get an outside reaction. And you really ought to think about whether it's absolutely necessary, or whether it's going to, and in fact, teach what you're hoping to teach versus just become a distraction. And so I talk about that in the book. I think your idea, I talk about something else, which is kind of the euphemism treadmill and the ways in which, like I give the example of, the terms that have been used historically to refer to people, we would now say mentally disabled, but it used to be, ages ago it was like imbeciles, and then that became like a horrible term. And then, it was retarded, and that, initially was like a better term that was considered more positive, but then over time it took on sort of the negative connotations, and it had to be retired. And now we talk about, the intellectually disabled, and we'll have to see, 10, 20 years from now, whether that's come to be seen as a derogatory term and we're on to something new. And I think you're saying there's something kind of similar with the N-word, that, it's sort of, even though it was the euphemism that was supposed to sanitize, it has now kind of taken on the taint and the stain of the word itself. And maybe, we need to stop using it as freely as we do. I don't know. I think that's interesting. And I've not heard it before. So, but you may be right. And I think we may see, I think the fact that you're recognizing that kind of suggests to me, I think you may be onto something.
All right. I can tell you from within academia that we're already there. You're not supposed to say intellectually disabled anymore. You are supposed to, you're not supposed to label people. So we need to evolve our language in a way that we're not labeling people. We're talking about a condition that they have. I don't know what the exact word in that case would be, but
I can offer a little bit. I see a lot of discussion these days about cognitive neurological diversity and celebrating cognitive neurological diversity. That sort of replaced that language.
Right.
So that will be where we evolve next. I think you have a few concluding comments that you want to share with us, and then I'll show a copy of your book again. And I did put the link in the chat for those of you who would like to purchase it. So Suzanne, why don't you wrap us up?
I mean, look, just very quickly, thank you so much for joining with me tonight. And what I really appreciate about this discussion is that so many of you, I think, are kind of struggling to dare to speak. You have things you want to say, and you want to figure out how to say them and not to give up. And I think that's extremely important. I think it can be an enormous temptation right now to just sort of pull back and retreat and shut your mouth and stay away from any conversation that could get contentious, because, you can only lose out. And I think we'll really be impoverished as a society, and particularly at this moment where you're in Nashville, Tennessee. I'm sure you're witnessing some of the divisions in this country in a way that is hard to even fully appreciate sitting here in New York City, and we kind of need you to help us figure out how to have these conversations and to take the risks and do the work. And if the book can be helpful, that's wonderful. And I really just enjoyed the chance to be with you and hear from you tonight. So thanks so much for having me.
Thank you very much for joining us. And the book really is a very good how-to manual on how to endeavor with some of the challenges that we're facing. So here again is the copy of the book. And thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And yeah.
Be safe.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all so much. Thank you for joining us. Suzanne, really, thanks a million for your time. We very much appreciate you joining us. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.